All right, welcome Maryland Realtors to our 2025 session preview. I'm Lisa May, the Director of Advocacy for Maryland Realtors, and I am joined by someone who really needs no introduction for our members, Bill Castelli, our contract lobbyist with the Rifkin firm in Annapolis. I'm really happy that you're here today and we can take you through some of the legislative issues that we're going to be dealing with when the General Assembly convenes on January 8th in 2025. To get us started, I'm going to share my screen so that we can run through our PowerPoint here and just kind of keep you and keep us all on track. There we go. So I thought that we would start really with some session themes, big issues that we're going to hear about over and over and over again, maybe even some that suck all of the oxygen out of other discussions that are taking place. And the first of those is, of course, our state budget. Many of you may have read the headlines that we are facing some pretty steep out-year deficits in our state budget. Numbers for 2028, 2029, 2030 reaching somewhere in the neighborhood of $5 billion plus in deficits. And the General Assembly is starting to reckon with what that might mean for programs, for revenue enhancements, what we all like to call tax increases, and where those would come from. So, Bill, what's your take? I mean, are we going to talk about anything else other than the budget in this session?
Yes, we will be having conversations about other issues, but 95% of the conversation is going to be about the budget. And I think a lot of the issues that the legislature looks at this year is going to be within that context of the budget. And to provide a little more context to the budget too, Lisa mentioned it's the out years. We do in the short term have, at least for next year, Maryland has a balanced budget amendment. So that means every budget that they propose each year has got to, whatever's coming in has got to add up to whatever's going to go out. So they have to have a balanced budget for every year. So they've got some work to do in the next year of about close to $2 billion that they've got to resolve one way, marry up revenues with and spending cuts with what they're going to be spending. And I think, all the parties have said that everything's on the table, taxes, spending cuts. So we will see. But if a bill's got a fiscal note and it's got really nothing to do with the budget, but it's going to cost the state money in terms of, maybe an agency having staffing issues, that's going to be reviewed in the context of, okay, how do we pay for it? And so I think 95% of the conversations this year are going to be probably budget related.
And a lot of those budget woes are really tied to some of the big programs that have passed over the past couple of sessions, including the Blueprint for Higher Education and the Climate Solutions Now Act, which really leads us to the second point that is here on this slide, which is the implementation and maybe adjustments to that Climate Act and some of the energy efficiency targets that Maryland has set for itself, and whether those need to be revisited in terms of the budget deficits and things that they have created, or conversely, because of some of the happenings at the federal level and the outcomes of those elections, whether climate advocates in Maryland feel that they need to double down on climate policies here in Maryland to counteract what might be loosening of climate policies and goals at the federal level. So that's definitely a tension that we are watching. particularly because these climate mandates do come into play when we are talking about large commercial buildings and also multifamily residential buildings that were the targets of the Climate Solutions Now Act. So, Bill, I know you've been following some of that for us as well. Where do you see this going?
Well, you're 100% right. Everything is being reviewed in the context of the election. And it's not really clear what that means. Is it going to be the California model of we're going to, double down and be the voice of resistance to the new administration? Or are we going to reassess, where the country's at least where many folks in the country demonstrated they're at. So I don't think anybody's resolved that, but I do think you will see in the legislature efforts to embolden our efforts on these things, but it will really come down to where leadership sees this going. And they've got some other fiscal headwinds, besides the ones that that you mentioned too. I mean, Medicaid. There's been about $1 billion, overrun in terms of Medicaid expense that Maryland's dealing with too, and that's driving some of it. And the Kerwin money, they've kind of segregated off enough money for this year and next year. So it's those following years where that Kerwin really starts to impact the budget. And that's why I do think when you're taking a look at all the climate change recommendations, the Kerwin implementation, that one of the things that will receive a lot of discussion is how that spending occurs and when it occurs, which means they may not necessarily back off on some of the requirements, but I do think the state legislature and the administration are going to be looking at whether it makes more sense to put it on a different glide path in terms of phasing in when certain requirements occur, which would then push off some of those revenue needs to later years. So it's more of a delaying than actually undermining or cutting out some of those programs. But I do think you're going to hear all of the above during the legislative session. You will hear folks who want to significantly change those programs based on the fact that the budget is in the situation it is. People who are saying, taking a more middle of the road approach. Many legislators will be saying, no, we don't need to cut that stuff. Just need to draw it out and create a smoother glide path in terms of implementation so that we're not all faced with those big numbers in the next 5 years. Maybe we spread out the cost of those programs over 10 years. And then you'll have other folks who are going to still want to move forward. And if they do move forward and they don't delay or they don't make those cuts, there's no way, I won't say there's no way to do it without spending cuts, but it is hard to imagine that you can do it through just spending cuts. So that in that case, it would be, some significant, tax policies, whether it's fees, taxes, it is definitely, I think, would be on the plate of the legislature.
Right. And for our purposes here in Realtor land, when we start to hear revenues, the House threw out any number of revenue proposals last year in an attempt to be, I think from their standpoint, proactive on and try to get ahead of these deficits. Where that impacted us the most was the proposal of the sales tax on services, on professional services, which hits, of course, our members, all of our affiliated real estate industries, all of the services that go into construction and development of new housing. And then we also had the Fair Share for Maryland Act, which changed the tax treatment of estates, capital gains, and revenues for pass-through entities. So we may very well see those proposals come forward again, at least from the House side, because they've been far more open, Bill, to looking at revenue raisers than the Senate and the Moore administration have been, at least up until this point.
Yeah, that's correct. I mean, I think the House has been the most proactive in wanting to identify some significant revenue packages, so tax packages to kind of right size the state budget with the spending needs. I think the Senate and the administration have been certainly more reluctant than the last legislature. But I do think as, you know, our budget picture clarifies this year and next year, and, you know, there's a group, the Spending Affordability Committee, that meets 3 or 4 times a year, and they take a look at what the incoming revenue is, whether it is tracking what they projected, and then also what state agencies are spending. And of course, state agencies have a really good control over discretionary spending, but when you have entitlement programs like Medicaid, which I spoke about, with the $1 billion of kind of unanticipated expenditures there, then those things, you know, start to drive a different picture of what's going on with the state budget. And I think those are some of the things that are driving, even the Senate president recently said, you know, everything is on the table. Spending cuts, tax increases, everything's on the table. Doesn't mean that they're committed to any of those things, but they will all have discussion this year before the legislature. And I would expect that they are going to do something. It's just a question of what, you know, tax on services. The last time they increased tax on services, they did almost very similar to what they proposed last year, which was they floated a bill that effectively would have taxed everybody, all professional services. And then the next year they came back and they did not move forward with that. They came back the next year with a more targeted bill. So last year we had the bill that effectively would have applied a service tax to, and I shouldn't say just professionals, it's to any service provider. So this year, you know, we may see that broad-based bill again, but I do think they are taking a look at, you know, how do you narrow down, you know, what types of services are we going to be focused on? Is it more retail services? Is it more professional services? So I do think that's going to be a very big discussion this year.
And one where we may need your help as realtors, depending upon the parameters of that bill and what kind of traction that it gets. You all rallied in Annapolis in 2020, the last time that bill was up. And depending upon which way it goes, we may be calling upon you again to engage your elected officials on that issue. Well, we are going to be optimistic and say that these issues are not going to be the only ones that will get attention from the General Assembly. So let's move on to some of our more real estate specific legislation. If I can get the slides to advance here. There we go. And let's talk about housing. You know, we did have a statewide housing bill last year, which was a very good start in terms of providing more buyer choice in the real estate market, providing more inventory for our home buyers to take advantage of. And we are looking to, again, push forward this issue in 2025 because there is no one silver bullet that is really going to get us all of the housing options that we need here in the state and to close our housing shortage. So the first bill and one of our top priorities for this session is going to be accessory dwelling units. And that is an issue that we have talked to all of you about for many years now. We had implementation bills that were introduced back in 2021, 2022. It was put into a study, and a task force looked at a host of issues surrounding accessory dwelling units and how to incorporate those into local zoning ordinances. That task force came out with their recommendations this past summer, and we understand that a bill to implement those recommendations will be introduced in the 2025 session to allow at least one accessory dwelling unit by right on single-family residentially zoned properties throughout the state. And while that may not be innovative for the country, there are so many states that are already doing this. It is a really big change for Maryland, and one that could add, as many as 20,000 dwelling units across the state to provide options for the elderly or for, recent college graduates, people who need to stay close to home, but don't have the means necessarily to be out in the marketplace getting a full home of their own. So we're very hopeful that that bill will see some traction this year and not face the same type of opposition we have seen coming from local governments on that state level intrusion into what they perceive as their exclusive jurisdiction for land use planning. And then we have some other things that are still kind of in the works, which I don't know, Bill, like for it to be December and to not have some of these policies kind of fully fleshed out is perhaps a little different than what we experienced last year around this time coming from the administration. But we do expect that DHCD will be looking at some sort of legislation dealing with housing affordability, with first-time buyers. They too have had to reassess their plans in the wake of the federal elections. So we are kind of waiting to see what they come out with. Bill, what is your take on how the General Assembly views housing now that we've kind of dipped that toe into the state taking action in what historically has been a local planning process?
Yeah, I think it's because it was such a, we can talk about the impact of last year's bill and, the fact that, the hope and the expectation is that it is going to drive supply increases, particularly around kind of transportation hubs. But because it was such a significant change in terms of the state taking action, and it's not like the state hasn't ever, stepped into local planning decisions since the early 1990s. They have really weighed in on local comprehensive plans, dictating what those plans must cover, certain elements of those plans, dictating zoning overlay zones for critical areas, septic areas, things like that. But I think this was a much kind of deeper dive and more directive in terms of what can be permitted into a county. Before we were just saying, hey, your comprehensive plans need to have these 17 things, but they really left it up to the locals to really decide, okay, I've got to have a housing thing, an environmental water thing. This is pretty clear. I mean, whatever your permitting, zoning, and comprehensive plans say within certain areas, you're going to approve these plans. So it's much more directive. And I do think because it was a pretty bold step last year, that it's going to give a lot of folks the backstop of, well, we did all these big things last year, and they did. So those folks who are reluctant to do anything in terms of stepping on local authority and local jurisdiction, they will, I think, my opinion, use that as a way to try and step back from that, and to the extent that any of those changes would have fiscal impacts, and they all theoretically do, even if it's not at the state level, it'll still impact, county budgets in some way. That'll be another hurdle that all of these proposals will have to jump over. So I do think, depending on what's proposed this year, if it is, an equally bold proposal, it may be tougher this year than it was last year.
Yeah. And we've had some good questions come in on accessory dwelling units, one of which gets to probably the biggest flashpoint on accessory dwelling units that we hear within the General Assembly, which is, are they really used for housing or are they used as short-term rentals? And there are a number of General Assembly members who are concerned about that. The task force did not touch that within their report. Essentially, that would be left up to the localities to decide, just as they do now, what the rules and regulations are about short-term rentals, the number of nights that you can have as a short-term rental, whether they need to be licensed, taxation of those. But it is a very, very controversial issue that we saw when we testified on ADU legislation previously. Then as to the financing portion of accessory dwelling units, the federal lenders, Fannie and Freddie, and FHA have actually been doing a whole lot of work in this space and are in fact incorporating ADUs into some of their mortgage approval processes. So we've seen a lot of progress there, which should in fact support what we are doing with accessory dwelling units here in the state. To our next points on this slide about supply and affordability, one issue that comes up quite often is that our homeowners and our renters property tax credit programs, which provide financial assistance to our very low income renters and homeowners, the income limits and asset limits for those tax credit programs have not increased in many, many years, which means that as housing prices have increased, as incomes have increased, as we have increased our state minimum wage, fewer and fewer people are able to take advantage of them. And those that are just outside those income limits really do have financial hardships that could be helped by an expansion of these tax credits. Of course, as we mentioned, the budget situation, expanding a tax credit is going to have a fiscal impacts note attached to it. So while expanding those tax credits would be very helpful, it is going to be kind of an uphill battle in the budget situation that we find ourselves in. And then finally, we have heard that there is going to be a bill introduced on adequate public facilities ordinances, or APFO, as it appears here on this slide. And adequate public facilities ordinances are typically used as a means to time infrastructure construction with new development. However, they can be abused in practice or used as a way to stop housing production that we desperately need. This bill is going to be even more than accessory dwelling units, even more than any of the other issues on housing that we've discussed here today. This is going to be a big fight with local governments on this issue because they view APFO as critical to their planning process for new developments. So it's going to be a really interesting conversation, I think, Bill, but one that probably doesn't have the best outlook, at least at present.
Yeah, I would say, given the fact that the counties, were asked to really belly up to the bar last session and on some of these housing issues, it's going to be very hard to get them, to find a solution on AFO that I think they're going to be comfortable with. Um, and I do think it's a tough push, but it's actually a really, I think, important conversation for the state, local governments, and the building industry to have, because there are a lot of impediments to creating supply, not just in Maryland. I mean, this is all across the country. And there are going to have to be some difficult steps taken if we really want to marry supply of housing with projected populations in our state and other states. So I will tell you, one of the things that I think came out of the presidential election was just a very clear picture of the fact that people are feeling, you know, people call it inflation, but one of the biggest impacts on inflation right now have been housing costs. When you start to take a look at, the things that people complain about in terms of inflation. So there are no real easy solutions on housing supply. Um, I think accessory dwelling units actually is one of the easiest solutions you can take, but everything else is tough. It's tough, and they're going to be very difficult conversations. Lots of people on all sides of that issue. So some big political fights.
Yeah, and a question that came in on APFO, we of course have not seen the bill or its language. We just know that it has been submitted, but it is our understanding that this would not eliminate local government's ability to have an adequate public facilities ordinance, but it would in fact put some limits on, how long you could stop a development from moving forward if, say, a facility was inadequate. It also might put some restrictions on, you could only hold up a development for inadequacies in these particular areas, whether it's school capacity or traffic or things of that nature. But it's going to be a very robust discussion. I certainly anticipate as we move forward on that. All right, well, let's move on to two bills that may seem very familiar to you, and that is because they are in fact repeats from prior General Assembly sessions. The first being condo and HOA resale fees. And this is an issue that we continue to hear from our members about over and over and over again, that they have been charged fees in excess of what the statute allows, that associations tend to play some games with requiring expedited delivery fees. And we threw in a bill last year to really try to lock that down, to get a handle on the fees that are charged by the associations and their management companies. Of course, those associations didn't take too kindly to our efforts. It is a profit center for them. But given the importance of this to our members, it's a bill that we are going to keep hammering away at and keep taking that message to the General Assembly, because it really is, it's so difficult that buyers have to order these documents. They have exactly one place that they can get them from, and they are completely at the mercy of whatever these associations charge them for these documents, which is unlike other any other part of the real estate transaction. Bill, can you talk about why this has been such an uphill battle for us in trying to lock these fees down?
Yeah, I think despite Maryland's reputation as being a progressive liberal state, they really do have reservations about limiting fees, fee controls, things like that. So I do think that's part of why this has been a difficult process. They would rather let the markets make decisions about what some of these fees are. But I think one of the reasons why back in 2015 they were willing to limit this and put into law kind of a statutory cap on these fees is because they had seen such a growth in the cost that people were paying for these resale packages. I mean, it went from $25 to $700 in some cases. And so they really locked down the fees. They put in a statutory cap. They put in a cost of living adjustment that could be added every 2 years. But that original, group that got together and really discussed locking those fees down, when they drafted the legislation, they made it clear that it was those fees and only those fees. At least that's what the conversation was about. And in the years since that bill has passed and the statute has become law and being enforced, what we've seen is that companies have created, as Lisa said, all of these new fees in addition to the fees that were capped. So I think that's where it seems, there seems to be a real disconnect between what the spirit of the law was in 2015 and kind of where we are today, and why we want to make sure, and in fact, had legislation last year to really clarify that, yes, the 2015 fees that we discussed are the fees. And you can't, there's no, computer, upgrade fee, delivery fee, restocking fee, all of these things that we've seen on people's reports that can be added in addition into those fees, because it makes, honestly, the caps that were put in place meaningless. So there are, I will tell you, legislators who are interested and who want to do much more than, kind of lock down the current statute, which is what our bill would have done last year, and who are very interested in actually lowering the fees. So I don't think anybody in our industry would have a problem with that. It's just whether that bill would even have a chance moving forward. So it's just about, it's more of a political calculation in terms of, would that bill have a chance moving forward in the legislature with votes. I will say, given the fact that inflation, housing costs are on people's mind, we are getting more to a point where there are more and more legislators who are sensitive to that, I think would be supportive of the bill. But it's getting to the magic number that you need to get a bill through committee and passed on the floor.
Absolutely. And sometimes it takes a legislator that has been through the process of ordering condo or HOA docs themselves to realize, wait, what are all of these fees and why am I paying them? Yeah, it's a conversation we are going to keep having as long as folks are being overcharged for these documents. And this is where we will actually ask for some of your help. If you have come across this, if you have a receipt for HOA docs that you have ordered on behalf of a client, or a screenshot, if you've been on an online portal, please feel free to send those to us. My email is lisa.may@mdrealtor.org. We can put that in the Q&A here as well. But every example that you can give us to show that this really is a widespread practice helps us in those conversations with legislators on this issue. And I'm just going to check the Q&A here just to make sure I didn't have anything else on HOA. Okay, we will save that question for a little later. The second issue here is, again, a repeat bill from last year that has to deal with the assignment of contracts, or what we call a quote unquote wholesaling transactions in Maryland. we've been engaged on this issue for a number of years, and last year finally came to what we think is sort of a consensus agreement to require that if a buyer of real estate is going to assign the contract to a third party, that there needs to be a disclosure so that everyone in the transaction knows exactly who they are dealing with. We had an example from our lobby day last year where a member of ours was involved in a transaction where a contract to purchase a home had been assigned 4 different times within the single transaction, which creates a lot of confusion. Disclosures and required notices can slip through the cracks in that process. Financing may not be available, or at least certain forms of financing. So we are hopeful this year that we will be able to get this bill across the finish line. We had some good success in the House. It just kind of ran out of time in the Senate before adjournment last year. But we're hopeful that at least this year, we should be able to get something on the books to help protect consumers, sellers, and buyers within a transaction where a contract is being assigned. Bill, did you have anything to add to that?
Not really. I mean, the one thing I will say is that, you know, in the past on this issue in particular, we've explored kind of more aggressive approaches, including licensing of these folks, things like that. You know, the budget climate that we're in right now, those are just non-starter conversations. I think the approach we had last year in terms of disclosure and penalties, if there's no disclosure, makes a lot of sense. And I think actually has a chance of getting enough votes to pass. So.
Absolutely. And yes, to a good point that was raised, you know, any assignment of contracts legislation that does pass will, of course, go through our forms committee to make sure that the appropriate forms comply with the law that is passed when contracts are assigned. All right, moving along, another issue that we have heard about a lot as our real estate market has remained very tight in terms of supply, as folks have become more desperate to, oh, excuse me, hit that button a little too quickly. As folks have become a little more desperate in finding rentals and housing, real estate fraud has sort of reared its head again. We've heard a number of instances of seller impersonation, particularly when it comes to the sale or marketing of vacant land parcels, and also the reemergence of squatters in properties for sale or for rent. And it's difficult to get our hands around some of these and find a legislative fix that really gets to the root of the problem, as opposed to creating more work or more costs for buyers or sellers, or something that is just window dressing that seems like we did something, but doesn't really get to the heart of the issue. And for seller impersonation, that has been the really hard one. We had a bill last session where they would have required the seller to conduct a title search. That doesn't really do anything if someone is impersonating the seller, other than require perhaps 2 title searches to be conducted within the same transaction. So that was a non-starter. Obviously, the judiciary in Maryland is very interested in this issue. The clerks of the court, the title companies, all of those groups have a part to play in this, including realtors. And we hope that all of you are verifying your buyers and sellers, making sure that they are who they say that they are, if they contact you by email or text or phone. But coming up with a legislative fix, Bill, that gets a little harder.
Yeah, it gets very hard because like many things you want to legislate, it really comes down to enforcement. These are illegal acts that are already taking place. So there's already laws on the books about, whether you can or can't, impersonate and effectively steal someone's proceeds of sale. So it really comes down to enforcement actions. And so it's hard to structure a bill in a way without funding to improve enforcement, because a lot of enforcement issues really do come down to resources. So a lot of them are funding issues, and that I think is where, in conversations that we had over the summer, particularly with the clerks of the court and others, it really does come down to a resource. They don't have the resources to verify all of this themselves. If they were going to do that, they would end up having to deputize a lot of real estate agents, requiring you guys to start to do stuff that, which itself would, I think, give many of us pause. Because then, the part of that burden and liability is on you as well. So, and these folks are pretty sophisticated. So, the ongoing discussions are still, what makes sense in terms of like statutory protections? Do we need any more? And then, given the fact that these are already illegal actions, is there a process and a protocol that can be set up and maybe even legislated to make it more likely that these actors will be identified and stopped before someone's proceeds are taken. So I will tell you, after 3 or 4 meetings over the summer, I don't feel like we're a lot closer in what that magic bill is going to look like, other than we've identified the fact that enforcement is really the key here.
Absolutely. And speaking of enforcement, that is where the issue of squatting comes in. Unfortunately, these scammers are very sophisticated. They know state laws, and in tenant-friendly states in particular, they know that they can forge a lease that says, "Oh, no, I'm renting this property." And that creates a real conundrum for our law enforcement to know whether these individuals are valid tenants or if they are trespassers. But we know from a number of our elected officials who have needed to intervene in cases of squatting within their districts that there is a lot of interest in this issue, because allowing a squatter to claim a tenancy then puts them into the courts, and the eviction process is not a short one in Maryland, and having someone's home occupied by an illegal occupant for weeks or for months on end is really an untenable position for us here in Maryland. But there have been some examples recently of even tenant-friendly states who've been able to make some progress in this issue. I know that New York did through some of their budget language. And Bill, we even worked on a bill a couple years ago to address this issue in Maryland, and maybe that will get some new life now in this General Assembly.
Yeah, and this, as you said, comes down to enforcement issue too. So it does, one of the bills that was introduced a couple years ago that we supported would deal with an expedited process for these tenants who are illegally occupying the property. It's called wrongful detainer under Maryland law. So we would have established a quicker process. Some other states, as Lisa mentioned, more tenant-friendly states, have done some things, even with trespass, giving the sheriffs and other folks who are in charge of enforcing, these tenant or engaged with tenant evictions, the right to do that. But it does, raise questions like if you're working within the trespass law, you still need a sheriff's office that is willing to do that, exercise that right themselves, feel comfortable about it. There is some concern on the part of some folks that even at giving them that trespass right, if they still show that lease, folks are still going to be able to say, hey, will sheriffs, kind of uniformly take that action that you want them to. So I think it's unclear. I think an expedited process, the sooner you can get to court, have an objective third party take a look at it. You're not on a lease. You can't demonstrate, any of the documents that you have to demonstrate. Then that seems to me to be the better solution. But we'll see what happens. And I agree with Lisa. There are more and more legislators who are getting more complaints about this issue from their constituents, which is why I do think that there will be a time, whether it's this year or a following year, where the legislature is going to be ready to do something. And we'll see which direction it takes.
And Bill, can you confirm when would someone gain essentially the rights of a tenant through occupying the property in Maryland?
I mean, so they don't really gain, anybody who is effectively trespassing, they don't really gain the right to that property as a tenant unless you have, unless they can demonstrate that you had knowledge of their presence, that you gave them permission to be on the property. And if you gave them permission, someone comes up to the property owner and says, hey, I know I'm here illegally. I was homeless. I got kicked out of my apartment. I just need a week. Can you give me a week and then I'll get out of here? And then they use that as demonstrating permission for them to be there. And then it's, 6 months to get them evicted from the property. So I think it really turns on that. There's not like a time period where, theoretically, the longer they've been there, the court may assume that you've had knowledge, whether you've had knowledge or not, the longer they've been there. So then it becomes more of an eviction process rather than like a wrongful detainer process. But I do think that, for folks who are in a property illegally, setting up a separate process makes a lot of sense, and it could be certainly an expedited process by the courts. Now that will have issues as well, the courts talking about funding and resources as well, but I do think that's a process that makes sense.
And one that has worked in other states
Mhm.
successfully as well. Yeah.
And I will tell you, there are some local jurisdictions where there are no backlogs. And some of them are more rural areas. The months that it might take to evict someone, say in Prince George's County or Montgomery County, it's a couple of weeks in some of the rural areas. So
Yeah. All right, we're getting to the home stretch, so we'll run you through just a couple of other bills that we are working on. The first is sort of a cleanup and clarification bill in terms of continuing education. So before anyone gets worried, nope, we're not raising hours. We're sticking with 15. Don't worry about that part of it. But as many of you know, NAR is moving towards a 2-hour fair housing requirement for Realtor members, whereas our state fair housing requirement is 1.5 hours for licensure. That has the potential for folks to accidentally choose the wrong class in terms of keeping their license current, in terms of keeping their Realtor membership current. So what we are proposing is to move the state fair housing requirement to 2 hours so that it is a uniform requirement, which will then reduce elective hours that you need to take by 30 minutes to keep that overall 15-hour total. Then on brokerage relationships and disclosures, many of you may remember that we passed a continuing education bill for initial licensees, for brand new licensees, that they take different continuing education classes in that first renewal period than more seasoned agents would take in their subsequent renewal periods. Along the way of passing that bill, the Real Estate Commission determined that the brokerage class for new agents was distinct from the brokerage class for renewal agents. Again, creating confusion if a real estate licensee were to select the wrong class for their licensure, that could put them in a tough spot. We're going to clarify that brokerage relationships, that Brad class is Brad class, no matter where you are in your renewal cycle. Third part is for exclusively commercial agents. So those who do no residential transactions. Those agents are allowed to essentially exempt themselves from taking fair housing as part of their license renewal. That's in one part of the statute. Another part of the statute says you can substitute the Americans with Disabilities Act instruction for fair housing. And that creates some uncertainty and a little bit of a conflict. So we're going to clarify that to say that exclusively commercial agents should take ADA compliance as part of their required CE. And then the final part in the bottom corner here is we are going to clarify the requirements on the certification of CE instructors, because given the turnover that we are experiencing both within the industry and within our state and local associations, making sure that we have qualified instructors to meet all of our members' continuing education needs is a top priority. We can't have any delays in making sure that we are fully staffed and fully able to deliver the CE credits that all of you need to maintain your licensure. So that's a very, kind of technical inside baseball type bill, but it is one that we are going to be working on this next session. And then finally, and this is the last piece of our Realtor agenda, we are going to look at, and we have had discussions with, Bill and I have had discussions with the Department of Natural Resources. And that may seem like a sort of an odd entity for realtors to have discussions with. But at the state, the Department of Natural Resources operates an online mapping system, which can show things like critical areas, dewatering zones, floodplains, things of that nature that are all notices and disclosures that go into our contract. And I'm sure that you, like our form staff, get a little annoyed every year when there is a new paragraph that gets added to our forms, makes them even longer, is one more thing that you have to walk your clients through. So Bill had the wonderful idea, and we're exploring this, of essentially creating a one-stop shop online where buyers could go to one web address, enter in the street name and number of the property that they are looking to purchase, and find all of the relevant information that goes along with that property. And we've had some promising discussions with DNR about that process, Bill.
Yeah. And to be clear, it's Department of Natural Resources, and there are other state departments that have geographic information systems too. But they seem to have the one that encompasses more of the kinds of disclosures that you and sellers are required to provide to buyers. So the thought is if they can aggregate some of the existing disclosure in like a resale tab, you would be able to, without much change and much resource required on the part of the agency, have a buyer and even a seller, if a seller wants to make sure that they're, what their disclosure requirement is going to be to buyers, where they would check, is this a forest, is the property subject to a conservation easement of some kind, floodplains, wetlands, etc. So it would cover a number of the disclosures that are included in the contract. It maybe reduce some of the length of the contract and disclosures that buyers have to wade through, and provide them very explicit, information. Property's in or it's out. And then they would have that ability to, if it's in, to explore that some more and figure out if, that's something that they want to negotiate on or move on to another property.
Absolutely. One question that came in, would it include Superfund site proximity?
So I think the goal would be hopefully in the future, yes, but that is information that is kept by the federal agencies right now. So that we had that conversation with them and trying to figure out if there's a way to link, to the federal. So I think the initial answer to it is no. And that would require, I think, more significant programming and resource expenditure on the part of DNR to set that up. So I think the initial answer is no, but maybe in the future there will be a way to do that.
Right. And Bill, we aren't anticipating that this would include any tax credit information or anything like that. It would really get more just into those disclosures and those notices.
True. But, the conversations that we've had is that once you've built it, you can add to it. And these are all state agencies. So it's just plugging in that state information. The reason I don't think tax credits would, so if you wanted to, we thought ground rents, what's all the SDAT information that you guys are interested in as well? Is the property subject to a homestead tax credit, or a homeowner's tax credit? Is there a ground rent? So there's a lot of good information there as well. It's not GIS, information that SDAT provides. So that would take a little more effort to include that. But, hopefully as this gets, our hope is that if they can start with this, that it gets built up and built out to cover, even more than just these kind of environmental issues.
Right. And particularly, in the sessions to come, when they come up with new disclosures and new notices, that we can say, sure, put them in the portal. And so that we aren't doing all of the dramatic changes to our forms that and reshuffling that we have to do each year. Finally, and this is one that is not a legislative proposal that we are anticipating will be put pen to paper this session, but one that we are starting to have discussions around, particularly with our realtor and industry members within the General Assembly, is this notion of a transactional brokerage relationship. And the idea comes from situations where perhaps you have a seller and a buyer who have already agreed that they want to enter into a transaction together. They don't need to negotiate price or anything like that. They're coming to an agreement, but they would like to have a real estate professional help them get from contract to settlement. It would be essentially a non-exclusive agency relationship, more of a facilitator of a transaction. And there are other states that allow this model. And we're sort of having discussions, is this something that could make sense for Maryland in light of the things that are transpiring at the national level, with the NAR settlement and some of the other things that are going on. So while we're not anticipating introducing this bill and having it go into effect October 1 of 2025, it is one that we wanted to make you aware of so that you can start thinking about it within how that might work within your own brokerages, with your clients, and sort of think about, is this something that could work for us? And Bill, I know that you've been involved in sort of this as well.
Yeah, and it's really, at this point, getting feedback from folks, as we plan out, future legislative efforts. There's 22, 24 states now that have some kind of facilitator transactional brokerage. Different states use it differently. So there's a lot of difference of practice between some states and how it gets used. So there's a lot of research that is still ongoing, but I do think it's, it's going to continue to be a topic of conversation within the industry, not just Maryland. Obviously, with 24 other states, it's a conversation that's going on all over the country.
It is. When we speak to our counterparts around the country, I think everyone has sort of stopped to take a look at what their brokerage laws are and what this, quote unquote, we say it a lot, maybe too much, new normal is for real estate transactions. But even if we were to introduce a bill this year, which we aren't, we do think that it's going to take a lot of education among members of the General Assembly who don't know all the inner workings of real estate brokerage laws, and also a lot of education for our members on how to use this correctly, what you can and cannot do, and to make sure that this doesn't become some sort of undisclosed dual agency in practice. So really, this is something that we're looking ahead to for 2026, 2027, 2028, more than likely by the time that we get everyone really comfortable with the law and how this would work in practice moving forward. So let's see, I do see some questions kind of coming in on this. So we just said, is this dual agency? And our answer to that really is emphatically no, this would not be dual agency. And that has been a distinction, Bill, that we've tried to keep within our state laws for a long time.
Yeah, and it's also true that some of the states that have it also do not permit it as a kind of form of dual agency too. Some states do, but not all of them.
Right. And then a question, what is the life expectancy of sub-agency in Maryland? And it's a fantastic question because that is something that we have discussed as part of this process as well. Should this replace sub-agency? Should it not? And that is, in fact, partly why this bill is taking a little slower of an approach than we first anticipated when we discussed it. So let's see here. And yes, question, a comment from Deb about understanding Brad. This would absolutely require a full revision of Brad continuing education it would require forms, it would require a whole lot. And that is why we are looking for, if this changes to occur, then we would need a lot of practice, a lot of education on this new form of brokerage relationship in Maryland. So, Bill, can you talk about how this might work or not with assigned or designated agency? Would we still have a place for that, within our brokerage law?
Yeah, I mean, it is certainly it can work with the designated agency in the sense that if you're, in an in-house transaction and you've been designated as a facilitator, transactional broker, or whatever the name's going to be, that would carry through those in-house transactions along with designated agency. Some states, don't do it that way. So I think that's also one of those questions like sub-agency that, they would really, there's still conversations to be had about it. No decisions have been made.
Yeah, and it is important, guys, that we get this right. We don't want to throw something out there that isn't fully considered, that creates chaos in the marketplace. So that's why throwing these questions out is incredibly helpful, and considering all of these different angles, all of the different situations that occur within your businesses, help us to craft a proposal that really is sound and that works from the get-go as we move forward with this. So we do appreciate your feedback on that. We do have a couple of general questions that came in, which I also appreciate. One, the Justice Department considering buyer agency agreements and how that relates to state law. Our state law is our state law, and the settlement is the settlement. We still have to comply with state law, and all of you have to comply with state law. So using buyer agency agreements, that is required of you and will continue to be until, obviously we experience a lot of change lately with federal action on real estate, but nothing so far has overridden a state's requirement to use those brokerage agreements. And then, as we mentioned at the top too, we have a new administration coming in that may take a completely different view of all of this from the current one. So we just have to wait and see. But until then, you are bound to follow state law in terms of what it says for what is a brokerage service and when those agreements are required. So I'm sure that we will have a lot more from that coming from our legal department on that. And then another good question: how does the Maryland Realtors decide which items become part of our Realtor agenda? And I love this question. It's a multi-step process. We have some very dedicated Realtor brokers and salespersons who serve on the Maryland Realtors Public Policy Committee. And they start meeting a week or two after the session ends. So they began meeting in April of 2024 to discuss issues for inclusion in our 2025 legislative agenda. And they consider 10, 12, 14 possible issues, pick and choose among the ones that they think are most needed. And they make recommendations to our Maryland Realtors Executive Committee. The Executive Committee has the final say on which bills become part of our legislative agenda or not. And so when the committee application process opens up next spring, Our Realtor members can apply to be part of the Public Policy Committee or any of our other committees that make recommendations for official policies for Maryland Realtors. So I hope that helps to answer how we come to the issues that you heard here today. If anyone has any last minute questions, of course, Bill and I can stay here for a little while, but you all have been wonderful hanging with us a little bit past our 2 p.m. stop time. One thing that we do want to plug while any last minute questions come in is the ways that you can be involved with us during the General Assembly session, which starts in January. And the big one is through our Maryland Realtors Lobby Day, which will take place on February the 12th here in Annapolis. We send over 200 Realtors out to meet with their delegates and senators and staff members to promote our Realtor agenda and to talk about the ways that policies made in Annapolis impact local communities, home buyers, and sellers. So we hope that you will join us for that. Please look for the registration to come out early in January for that event. And I am not seeing any other questions coming in. So with that, I do want to thank our good friend Bill Castelli for being with us here today. And thank you all for being here and for caring about our realtor advocacy that we are conducting upon your behalf every General Assembly session. Everyone take care, have a wonderful holiday season, and we'll see you again in the new year. Thank you.
Cheers, everyone.